The 202nd second of Formula 1141 was the one that mattered, and Dane Halloran spent it exactly the way he had spent the 201 before it, counting his own pulse down instead of up, 4 beats in, 4 beats held, 6 beats out, while a compound the color of old rust worked its way through the catheter in his forearm, and every monitor in Chamber 9 waited for a number that would not come. The restraint bar under his palms was cold enough to read as a fact rather than a sensation, which was useful, because facts didn't make his hands shake and sensations did. He fixed his attention on the cold, and under it, buried 3 layers down where no scanner had ever found it, he let the actual feeling happen, the slow chemical fire climbing his arm, the taste of pennies flooding the back of his throat, the specific vertigo of a body being lied to by its own blood. He let it happen because there was no version of surviving 4 years of this that didn't require feeling everything and showing none of it. "Heart rate 61, said the technician at the primary console, a reedy young officer named Corvath who had been assigned to Chamber 9 11 months ago and still flinched slightly every time the compound went in, as if some part of him expected a different result than the one he always got. Cortical activity baseline. Tremor sensors negative. "Run it again," said Overseer Adjutant Vrale, without looking up from the secondary display, and something in the flatness of her voice made Riel Sonar glance sideways at her superior for the first time in 11 weeks. Vrale did not attend routine calibration runs. Vrale had not set foot in Chamber 9 in over 4 months, had delegated every session below the executive tier to Corvath and to Riel herself, had made it clear through 100 small administrative signals that Formula 1141 and its 1,140 predecessors were beneath her direct attention now, a grinding administrative obligation rather than a live scientific question. She was here today. That fact alone told Riel more than anything on the readouts. "Overseer Adjutant," Riel said carefully, because someone had to say it, "we're at baseline saturation. Another run at this concentration won't produce new data." "I'm aware of the saturation curve, Technician Sonar," Vrale said. "Run it again." They ran it again. Dane's pulse, on the monitor that mattered, sat at 61, then 59, then 62. Moving in the small, unremarkable ways a resting human pulse moved for no reason at all, and nothing about the numbers suggested that a compound engineered over 11 months by a team of 4 specialists to disrupt neural signal transmission in every mammalian test species the Directorate had ever catalogued was, at that exact moment, doing exactly what it had been built to do, 3 layers down, where the machines simply were not built to look. Vrale watched the flat line for 11 full seconds after the drip had finished, her jaw set in a way Riel had learned, over 4 years of shared shifts, meant the Overseer Adjutant was doing arithmetic she did not like the answer to. Then she turned and left Chamber 9 without another word, and the heavy door sealed behind her with a sound like a decision being made somewhere out of sight. Corvath exhaled. "That's new." "She's under review," Riel said, which was not information she was supposed to share, and which she said anyway because 4 years in this room had worn most of the caution out of her in exactly the places that didn't matter to the Directorate and mattered enormously to the 2 people who had to work in it. The Cost Tribunal filed a formal inquiry into the calibration wing's resource allocation 9 days ago. 1,140 formulas, 4 years of station time, 0 certified results. Someone in the Directorate Council wants to know why they're still paying for this room. Corvath looked for a moment, faintly hopeful, the way a man looked when he thought a miserable job might simply end through no action of his own. Riel did not share the feeling. She had watched Vrale for 4 years, had learned the specific shape of the woman's ambition the way you learned the shape of a blade you worked next to every day, and she understood, in a way she did not yet have words for, standing in Chamber 9 with the compound already withdrawn from Dane's arm, that a Vrale facing the end of her career was a considerably more dangerous animal than a Vrale merely bored. They released the restraints. Dane sat up slowly, the way he always did, giving his body a full 10 seconds to arrange itself before he trusted it to hold weight, and reached for the water cup Riel set on the tray without being asked, the way she had for the better part of 3 years. His hand closed around it, lifted it, and for exactly 4/10 of a second before he brought it under control, the surface of the water shivered. Riel saw it. She had seen it 11 times before, always in that same window, the 10 to 15 seconds after a restraint release, before whatever internal machinery he ran caught up with itself and locked back down. She had never once written it in a report. "You're building up a tolerance to my terrible bedside manner," Dane said, his voice rough but steady, nodding at the cup. "Water's warm again. 4 years and you still can't remember I like it cold. The chiller's broken. It's been broken since batch 9. That's what you said during batch 7. It was also broken during batch 7. He almost smiled, the closest thing to it he allowed himself in a room with 2 functioning surveillance pickups, and a technician 11 months into a posting who hadn't yet learned not to report the small human things he saw. And Riel logged the session as concluded, negative, consistent with prior results. Formula archived pending overseer review, and did not write down the 4/10 of a second, because writing it down had never once in 3 years felt like the thing that would keep him alive. Riel had been assigned to the calibration wing 11 weeks after her own arrival at Kestrel Anchor, a posting she had neither requested nor been permitted to decline. She belonged to a species the Directorate catalogued, in the flattening administrative shorthand it applied to every subjugated people, as Ashvin's second tier, pale gray-blue skin built for a colder sun than the one Kestrel Anchor orbited, a second, inner eyelid that made the station's harsh recycled light easier to bear than it was for the humans she processed, and a tribute quota, negotiated 3 generations ago in a treaty her grandmother's grandmother had not lived to see signed, that tied every Ashvin household's ration allotment to a service record maintained, ultimately, by officers exactly like Kesavrail. She had understood from her first week in Chamber 9 that her own family's comfort back on a colony world called Threnhalo was bound, in ways no treaty ever stated outright but every Ashvin child learned before they could read, to how well she performed the small, specific cruelties her posting required of her. She had performed them for the first several months, with the flat professional distance the job seemed to demand. Formula after formula, subject after subject, there had been 2 others before Dane brief postings that ended in transfer, or, in one case that Riel still did not examine too closely, in a report she had filed and never once reread. And she had told herself, the way she suspected every technician in every calibration wing across 11,000 tribute worlds told themselves, that the work was simply work, that the numbers on her console were simply numbers, that a subject in a restraint frame was a data source and not a person whose name she was expected to remember. Dane Halloran had been the first subject whose name she had ever bothered to learn without being required to. She could not, 4 years later, point to the exact session when that had changed. It was not a single moment. It was the accumulation of small things. The fact that he thanked Corvath by name after every session, even the bad ones, in a voice that cost him visibly more than the thanks were worth. The fact that he asked, on his second week in the wing, whether the tremor in her own hands during a particularly difficult formula meant she needed a moment, when every protocol in the station's manual assumed concern only ever flowed one direction across that restraint bar. The fact that 4 years of a captivity that would have hollowed out most people she had ever processed had, instead, left him quieter, steadier, more exactingly kind in the small ways available to him than most free officers she had served beside. She had started, somewhere in the second year, to dread her days off more than her shifts, because a day off meant a full cycle without knowing, firsthand, that he was still all right. None of that showed up anywhere in her official file. It could not. An HFY technician who let a human test subject become the center of her professional life was, by any reading of her tribute contract, one report away from a reassignment that would cost her family's ration allotment more than her grandmother's grandmother had ever risked to secure it. She had weighed that cost, quietly, more times than she had ever admitted to anyone, and had gone on keeping her spindle anyway, because the alternative becoming, in truth, the kind of technician who saw a data source instead of a person, was a cost she had decided, somewhere in that second year, she was no longer willing to pay either. The program itself had begun 9 years before Dane's capture, cycling through 2 subjects before him, whose full records Riel had inherited on her first day and had read exactly once. Vrail had built the wing's early reputation on incremental efficiency, a catalog of 11,000 tribute worlds worth of native physiology cross-referenced and refined, doctrine tightened, one confirmed compound after another certified and shipped to distant water authorities without ever once returning a headline result. Humans had been, for the first 5 years of the program's existence, simply the 709th entry on that catalog, no more remarkable on paper than the 608 species that had come before. It was only in the last 4 years, only since Dane, that the entry had refused, formula after formula, to close. She had started keeping her own record instead, not on the station's systems. On a data spindle no larger than her thumb, encrypted with a personal key that existed nowhere in the directorate's registry, updated in the 11 minutes of unsupervised time she got at the end of every shift while she filed the official logs. She had never fully explained to herself why she did it. She told herself most nights that it was simple professional thoroughness, that somewhere down the line, someone competent might actually want to know what had really happened in Chamber 9 across 4 years and 1,100 formulas, and that when that day came, the directorate's own sanitized records would be worthless. She did not let herself examine, too closely, the fact that the person she imagined reading it someday was not a directorate auditor at all. Kessa Vrail's office sat 2 decks above Chamber 9, a narrow compartment with a single reinforced viewport looking out over the stripped gray curve of Syndrel's Rest. The dead mining world Kestrel anchor had orbited for the better part of a century, its resources long since hauled off to feed 100 more useful stations. Vrail had requested this specific office 9 years ago because the view reminded her. She'd once told a junior officer who never repeated it to anyone but Riel, of what ambition looked like when it had already succeeded and moved on. She sat now with the cost Tribunal's inquiry notice open on her primary display, and read it for the 6th time since it had arrived, as if a 7th reading might change the numbers embedded in its 2nd paragraph. 1,140 formulas, 1,478 days, station allocation cost, figures she did not need to read twice to feel in her stomach, certified positive results against the sole surviving test subject designated Halloran D.0. The Tribunal's language was bureaucratic, bloodless, the kind of prose the Directorate had perfected over 4,000 years of governing a galaxy through committee rather than conquest alone, and it did not need to be anything else to be devastating. A resource review, a formal site inspection, an arrival date 6 days out. And beneath all of it, unstated but perfectly legible to anyone who had spent a career inside the machinery of Directorate administration, the actual question the Tribunal was coming to answer. Was the calibration wing's entire founding premise that some compound, somewhere in the Directorate's 4,000-year pharmacological catalog, could produce on a human subject the same reliable pacifying, sedating, compliance-inducing effect that kept 11,000 tribute worlds quiet, a legitimate scientific program, or an expensive, career-building fiction that Kessa Vrail had been running for 4 years on the Directorate's coin? She knew, with the particular clarity of someone facing the end of everything she had built, exactly how bad the second answer would look. And she knew something else, something that made the inquiry notice feel less like a death sentence and more like a deadline. Every other pacification compound in the Directorate's arsenal worked on every other species in 11,000 tribute worlds. Not most, every one. The chemical architecture of imperial control, the sedatives in tribute water supplies, the compliance agents woven into rationed medicine, the neural suppressants that kept 11,000 worlds worth of subjugated populations too calm to organize, too docile to resist, too chemically pacified to remember, most days, that resistance had ever been an option, rested on a foundation of absolute, universal, 4,000-year reliability. Humans were the only species in the Directorate's recorded history against which not one compound in over 1,100 trials had ever registered. It had started as a curiosity. It had become, over 4 years, something closer to a rumor the Directorate could not officially acknowledge existed, whispers moving tribute world to tribute world, in the coded, deniable way rumors always moved under chemical suppression, that there was a species out there the compound simply didn't touch. The Directorate had a word, unofficial and never spoken by anyone above the rank of overseer, for what humans had become in that rumor. The unbroken. Vrail had heard it twice in her own station's mess hall, from officers who did not know she oversaw the very program the word referred to, and both times she had felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with scientific curiosity at all. A myth like that, left uncontradicted for another 4,000 years, was not a curiosity. It was a crack in the foundation of everything the Directorate had built. She opened the file she had kept sealed, unauthorized, unfiled for 8 months, the Cascade Protocol, a combined agent escalation ban from unsupervised use since an unauthorized trial 8 months prior had killed the calibration wing's previous test subject, a woman named Yara Petrosian, in under 4 minutes. The ban required tribunal sanction to lift. Vrail had never requested it, because requesting it meant admitting, on the record, that 1,100 formulas of incremental, sanctioned testing had produced nothing, and admitting that meant handing the tribunal exactly the failure they were already 6 days out from finding on their own. But the tribunal was coming anyway. The failure was going to be found whether she volunteered it or not. The only question left, the only lever she had any control over at all, was what happened in the 6 days before they arrived. She keyed a request into the station's medical authorization system. Emergency exception, Cascade Protocol, Subject Halloran D., to be conducted under full executive observation with tribunal witnesses present at time of arrival, framed not as a desperate last measure, but as the calibration wing's long-planned final verification trial. 4 years of incremental data building at last, to a definitive result. She dated the authorization for the morning. The tribunal's shuttle was scheduled to dock. If it worked, she would hand the Directorate the single most consequential pharmacological finding in 4,000 years of imperial pacification doctrine, in front of the exact auditors sent to end her career, and the wing would never face a resource review again. If it did not work, she told herself, closing the file, at least the failure would finally be complete enough that no one could keep asking her to fund incremental proof of it. She did not let herself finish the thought that came after that one. Dane's holding cell was 4 meters by 3, furnished with a cot, a fold-down desk bolted to the wall, and a single high window of reinforced composite that let in exactly enough of Syndral's Rest's gray daylight cycle to mark the hours without ever letting him forget he was looking at it through 6 centimeters of unbreakable material. He had lived in it for 1,478 days. He had stopped, somewhere around day 300, counting them as a countdown to anything, and started counting them instead the way his sister had once taught him to count anything unbearable, as a discipline, a proof that the mind could keep exact, unflinching track of a thing without the thing being permitted to break it. Ren had taught him the long count 4 years before the directorate ever found the relay line, back when she was a field medic running triage in the ruins beneath what had once been a city called Aldermarsh, and he was 19, and had just watched a man die of shock from a wound that should not, by any measure, have been fatal. She had knelt beside him afterward in the dust, and told him what she told every relay runner who came through her station, that the body could be talked out of dying if you gave it something simpler to do than panic. 4 counts in, 4 counts held, 6 counts out. Do it with your face relaxed, she'd said, because a scared face told your own nervous system to be scared, and a scared nervous system dumped exactly the chemicals into your blood that finished the job the wound had started. Control your face, control your breath, and you could walk through things that should have put you on the ground. She had not told him it would work on interrogation drugs. She had not known, in the year she had left to teach him anything, that it would. He had learned that part alone, in a directorate holding facility 400 light-years from Aldermarsh, 3 days after the ambush that took the last of the relay line's western couriers, and left him the only one of 11 runners the directorate patrol took alive. He had learned it because the alternative, a truth serum working exactly as designed, on a courier who had spent 6 years memorizing the coordinates of every hidden relay line, waypoint between the Syndral Reach and the free enclaves beyond the Holloway Deep, was not a possibility he had ever been willing to survive finding out. There were still 11 enclaves out there. 9,000, give or take, of people who had chosen the old bunkers and the cold ration lines, and the permanent fear of orbital scans over anything the directorate called a tribute settlement. If the calibration wing ever certified one compound, that reliably worked on a human nervous system, it would not stay a research curiosity. It would go into every tribute world water supply and every ration shipment across 11,000 worlds within a year, and it would go, within that same year, into whatever the directorate decided to feed the relay line's captured couriers before it started asking them questions. He had understood that math on his second day in Chamber 9, watching a technician prepare Formula 1 with the mild, procedural boredom of someone doing routine work, and he had made a decision he had never once, in 1,476 days since, allowed himself to revisit. The door chime sounded at what his internal clock, uncorrected by any actual daylight, told him was somewhere near the end of second shift. Riel's code, the specific double-tap sequence that meant off-duty and unofficial rather than the flat single tone of a scheduled session. He sat up. "You're not supposed to keep doing this," he said, when she'd sealed the door behind her. 4 years and you still haven't learned that unauthorized visits are exactly the kind of thing that gets flagged. 4 years and you still haven't learned to say thank you before you lecture me, Riel said, and set something down on the fold-down desk. A small foil-wrapped ration bar, the kind reserved for officer mess decks rather than detention blocks, traded for out of her own credit allotment the way she had, by his rough count, perhaps 200 times since the first month of his captivity. Vrail was in Chamber 9 today, in person. First time in 4 months. Dane's expression didn't change, which was, itself, a kind of answer. She doesn't come in person unless something's wrong on her end. The cost tribunal's sending an inspection team, 6 days out. 1,140 formulas and 0 results is apparently not a sustainable line item. Riel sat on the edge of the cot's footlocker, the closest thing this room had to a second chair, in a posture that had, over years, become something closer to habit than procedure. I don't know what she's going to do about it. I know what I'd do if I were her and I were desperate enough. There's a protocol on record from 8 months ago. It's been locked since Petrosian. Something in Dane went very still, in a way that had nothing to do with the long count and everything to do with a memory neither of them ever discussed directly. A name they both knew. A subject who had come before him in the wing's roster, and who had not lived through a combined agent trial run without proper safety review. "You think she'll request the exception?" "I think," Riel said, choosing the words with the particular care of someone who had spent 4 years learning exactly how much she was and wasn't willing to say inside a room with a surveillance pickup, "that a woman about to lose her command has fewer reasons than she used to have to run this program carefully." Dane looked at the small window, at the gray, unchanging light of a dead world's reflected glare, and said nothing for a long moment, and Riel, who had spent 4 years learning to read the 4/10 of a second after every restraint release, who had a data spindle in an inner pocket right now holding 1,140 logged instances of a tremor that officially did not exist, understood, without either of them saying it out loud, that whatever was coming in the next 6 days, it was coming for both of them. The escalation began 2 days later, and it began the way every escalation in the calibration wing's 4-year history had begun. Incrementally, with a fresh line item on Corvath's morning schedule and no explanation attached to it beyond a formula number Dane didn't recognize. Formula 1142 combined a neural suppressant base with a cardiac modulating compound the directorate had, according to the file header Riel glimpsed over Corvath's shoulder, previously used only in controlled surgical settings. It was not strictly the band cascade protocol. It was close enough to its outer edge that Riel filed a formal safety notation before the session began, citing subject cumulative exposure and requesting a secondary physician present for the run. Vrail denied the request in 11 minutes, a response time that told Riel the denial had been drafted before the request was even filed. The session ran 40 minutes longer than any prior trial. Dane's outward numbers held, pulse steady, tremor sensors negative cortical activity. Within the band, the machines had recorded, without exception, for 1,141 prior formulas. But Riel, watching from her console with the particular attention of someone who had spent 4 years learning exactly what to look for, saw the cost of it in the 6 seconds it took him to find his water cup afterward instead of the usual 2. In the faint sheen of sweat along his hairline that the room's climate control should have made impossible, in the way his jaw stayed tight for a full 90 seconds past restraint release instead of the usual 15. She said nothing in the official log. She logged 40 additional data points, in the format she had built for herself over 3 years and told no one about, on the spindle that lived against her skin under her uniform collar now instead of in a drawer, because some instinct she had stopped questioning told her the drawer was no longer safe. The pattern repeated for 4 more days. Formula 1143 added a third agent. 1144 extended the exposure window from 6 minutes to 11. Each time, the official numbers held at 0. Each time, the true cost, visible only to a technician who had spent 4 years learning a man's, tells the way you learned the tells of someone you had decided, somewhere along the way, without ever choosing to, mattered to you, climbed by a margin that made Riel's stomach tighten a little further. Formula 1143 was the one that nearly ended it early. Riel had built her manual sampling routine around the automated system's blind spots, the 2, 5, and 8-second marks inside every restraint release window, the intervals the station's fixed 30-second cadence never touched, and for 3 years those blind spots had been enough. On the 4th day of the new escalation schedule, with the third agent's dosage raised past anything the wing had trialed before, they very nearly weren't. At the 6-second mark, with the restraint still locked and Corvath's back turned to check the drip line, the tremor sensor's needle twitched toward positive and held there, not for 0.6 of a second the way it eventually would in the Tribunal's gallery, but for nearly 2 full seconds long enough, if the automated system had been sampling at that exact instant instead of 11 seconds off from it, to register on the permanent record as a first. Riel saw it happen from her own console, watched the needle climb and hang and fall, and understood in the half-second it took her pulse to catch up with her eyes that she had just watched 4 years of a man's discipline come within a heartbeat of failing in front of the one system built to notice. She did not move. She did not speak. She kept her hands flat on her console, and her face arranged in the same unreadable calibration technician, calm, she had spent 4 years perfecting for exactly this kind of morning. And she watched Dane's jaw work once, twice, the muscle along it standing out sharp enough to see from across the chamber, before his breathing found the old counted rhythm again, and dragged the rest of him back down under it with it. Anomalous fluctuation, tremor channel, Corvath said afterward, frowning at his own readout with the mild puzzlement of a man who had not been looking at the right second to understand what he'd nearly caught. Probably a calibration drift. I'll flag the sensor for recheck. I'll handle the flag, Riel said, too quickly, and made herself slow down before she said anything else. I've been meaning to recalibrate that channel for a week. I'll log it as scheduled maintenance so it doesn't read as an anomaly in the formal record. Corvath shrugged and went back to his own board, and if he thought anything of the fact that his superior calibration technician had just volunteered, unprompted, to personally handle a sensor recheck that fell well outside her usual duties, he did not say so. Riel filed the maintenance log herself that night, worded in the flattest, most procedural language the station systems allowed, and did not sleep afterward, lying instead in the dark running the 2 seconds over and over, understanding for the first time in 4 years exactly how thin the margin actually was, and how little control either of them had left over how much thinner it would get before the 6 days ran out. She told Dane about it the next evening. In the 11 minutes she'd learned to steal without ever quite calling it stealing. 2 seconds, she said. If Corvath's sampling window had lined up different by even a few ticks, that would have been on the permanent record this morning, instead of a maintenance log, only I ever have to look at again. I felt it happen. Dane's voice was quieter than usual, stripped of the dry edge he usually kept on even the worst updates. 11:43 was worse than anything before it. I don't have a clean count for how close it actually got. That's the part that scares me, Riel, not that it's getting harder. I already knew it was getting harder. It's that I don't have a reliable way to tell you exactly how much margin is left, because the whole method only works if I don't spend attention measuring itself while I'm using it. Then we build in more margin somewhere else. Riel had already been turning the problem over for most of the day, the way she turned over every problem now, with the specific methodical patience of someone who had decided a long time ago that patience was the only weapon she actually had. I can widen my own sampling intervals a fraction further past the automated cadence without it looking deliberate. It buys you less room to work with, not more, but it buys me more warning before the automated system gets there first. It's not nothing. It's not enough either if she keeps escalating the dose the way she has the last 4 days. He said it plainly, without self-pity, the way he said most hard things, and Riel had long since stopped expecting him to soften anything for her benefit the way most people did. How many more days until the tribunal lands? 2, maybe less if the routing update I saw this morning holds. Someone moved the shuttle's docking window up again. He was quiet for a moment, doing the arithmetic she had watched him do 100 times, and when he spoke again his voice had gone back to something steadier, more deliberate, the tone of a man choosing, once more, exactly which fight was worth having. Then 2 seconds is a warning, not a verdict. I'll take the warning. On the 3rd of those days, Vrail brought a second subject into the wing. Riel heard about it before she saw it, in the flat administrative language of a transfer manifest routed through her console for logistics sign-off. One human, male, designated Petrick, R., age 19, captured 4 days prior during a relay line supply intercept 2 systems out, held pending disposition. The manifest's disposition field read, with the bureaucratic blandness the directorate applied to everything it had not yet decided how to justify, potential baseline comparator, calibration wing. Dane heard about it from Riel herself. In the 11 minutes she risked at the end of a shift 2 days before the tribunal's revised arrival date. Moved up, she told him, by 1 full day, a change buried in a routing update nobody outside the wing's command staff had reason to notice yet. She wants a fresh subject, Riel said. No 4 years of adaptation, no baseline drift, nothing to explain away if the numbers come back different from yours. If a 19-year-old with 4 days in custody shows the same 0 result you do, it stops looking like something specific to you and starts looking like something true about the species. That's a stronger finding for her, if she can get it in time. He's 19. I know. He's got maybe 4 days of whatever they've already put him through in transit, and no one ever taught him how to survive Chamber 9. Dane's voice had gone flat in a way Riel had heard only twice before in 3 years, both times in the hours immediately after word of a relay line loss had reached him through channels neither of them ever named aloud. If she runs him through 1145, he won't know what to do with it. He'll just have it happen to him. There's nothing either of us can do about that particular fact tonight. Yes, there is. Dane was already standing, already moving through the small calculus Riel had watched him make 100 times before, weighing costs the way his sister had apparently taught him to weigh everything, with a clarity that never seemed to leave room for panic. Tell Vrail I'll volunteer for additional sessions. Doubled schedule, whatever escalation she wants, as long as it comes to me instead of him. 4 years of adapted baseline is worth more to her than 1 green subject anyway. If she thinks about it for a minute, I'm the one with the track record she can point to. Give her the argument. She'll take it if it looks like it strengthens her case instead of weakening it. Riel looked at him for a long moment, in the gray half-light of a cell that had held him for 1,481 days, and felt something she did not have a clean professional word for at all, not pity, which he had made clear once years ago, that he did not want from her, and not simple admiration either, though it was closer to that. It was something nearer to the specific ache of watching a person choose, again, without hesitation, to spend himself protecting someone he had never met. I'll tell her, Riel said. I can't promise she'll listen. She'll listen if it's framed as more data for less risk. That's the only language that's ever worked on her. He managed something that was almost a smile, thin and exhausted but real. For years, Riel, I've learned a few things about how this station thinks. She made the argument the next morning, framed exactly as he'd suggested, cost and risk and continuity of adapted baseline data, and watched Vrail consider it with the flat calculating expression of a woman doing arithmetic on 2 competing risks rather than 2 human lives, and watched her, after 11 seconds, nod once. Reroute Petrick, R to standard tribute processing. Increase Halloran's schedule to twice daily sessions through the tribunal's arrival. Vrail did not look up from her display as she said it, the decision already filed and moving on to the next item on a list that had, Riel understood now, stopped containing any room at all for anything but the 6 days remaining before her career was decided, and prep Chamber 9 for a full-capacity observation gallery. If the Cascade Protocol authorization clears in time, I want the tribunal in the room to see it happen, not reading about it after the fact in a report they can dispute. Riel saw Petrick once. In the 11 minutes it took the transfer manifest to root him out of the wing and into standard tribute processing. A glimpse through a corridor viewport as a directorate escort walked him past Chamber 9's outer checkpoint. A thin, dark-haired boy who still had the particular unweathered stillness of someone who had not yet learned that stillness was a survival skill rather than a natural state. Flinching at every sound, the station made the way a person, only flinched in their first days of captivity. Before 4 years or 400 days had taught them which sounds mattered and which didn't. He did not look toward Chamber 9's door as he passed it. He had no reason to know what had almost happened to him inside it, or who had spent an evening arguing, in the flat, unglamorous language of resource allocation, to make sure it hadn't. Riel watched him go and found she could not decide whether what she felt was relief or a colder, more complicated grief for the version of this station's history in which no one had been in a position to argue for him at all. Vrail, in the 2 days that followed, grew careful in a way that unsettled Riel more than the escalating formulas had. A woman with 6 days left before a tribunal inspection and an unauthorized protocol riding on the outcome did not, in Riel's 4 years of watching her, tend toward carelessness. She tended toward a narrowing, methodical paranoia, the specific vigilance of someone who understood exactly how a program like hers could be undone and had begun, belatedly, checking for the seams. On the 5th day, she ordered a full security sweep of the wing's personnel effects, framed in the routing manifest as routine pre-inspection compliance, standard practice ahead of any tribunal visit, nothing Riel could refuse without drawing exactly the attention she could least afford. The sweep reached Riel's own locker 2 hours before the end of her shift. She stood in the narrow changing alcove behind Chamber 9's outer bay while a junior security officer methodically inventoried the contents: a spare uniform, a ration chit, a data slate cleared for personal use and therefore of no interest to anyone, and felt the spindle's small hard weight against her collarbone under her uniform collar with an awareness so total it was almost audible, a second pulse keeping its own separate, much faster count. She had moved it there weeks ago, on an instinct she'd never examined too closely, and she understood now, watching the officer's gloved hands move through her locker with unhurried directorate thoroughness, exactly why that instinct had mattered. A locker was a place things were kept. A body was not, under any security protocol this station had ever written, a place anyone thought to look, because no technician in the wing's 9-year history had ever given anyone a reason to. "Clear," the officer said, and moved on to Korvath's locker without a second glance at her, and Riel walked out of the changing alcove into the corridor beyond it and stood very still for a moment. 4 counts in, 4 counts held, 6 counts out, borrowing without irony the exact discipline she had spent 4 years watching someone else survive on, before she trusted her own legs to carry her the rest of the way to her quarters. She did not visit Dane that night. It was the first night in 3 weeks she had let 6 days' worth of stolen minutes lapse into a full missed cycle, and she told herself, lying awake afterward, that it was simple caution, that a sweep week was exactly the wrong week to risk an unauthorized visit flagged on a corridor log somewhere. She did not let herself examine, too closely, how much of the decision had actually been fear, or how strange it felt, after 4 years, to be more afraid for herself than she had ever once let herself be for him. Korvath found her the next morning before shift start, in the narrow supply corridor behind Chamber 9, where technicians sometimes took their ration breaks alone, and the fact that he'd sought her out there instead of at her console told Riel, before he'd said a word, that this was not going to be a conversation either of them could afford to have on record. "The maintenance log," he said without preamble. "The tremor channel recalibration you filed after 11:43. I pulled the sensor's actual service history last night because I couldn't stop thinking about that 2-second fluctuation, and there's nothing wrong with that channel. Hasn't been touched in 6 months. It didn't need recalibrating." Riel kept her face very still, 4 years of practice holding it steady even as her pulse did something considerably less disciplined. "Korvath. I'm not filing anything." He said it fast, glancing once down the empty corridor, the particular haste of a man who had clearly spent most of the night deciding whether to say any of this out loud at all. "I've been in Chamber 9 11 months. I flinch every time the drip goes in, and I've never once let myself ask why, because asking why felt like the kind of question that gets a person reassigned somewhere worse. But I watched that needle hold for 2 seconds, and I watched you file a maintenance log for a sensor that didn't need one. And I'm not stupid, Riel. I don't know everything you know. I don't want to know everything you know, not with 6 days between now and the tribunal's shuttle. But I wanted you to hear it from me directly, once, before whatever's coming actually comes. Whatever you're doing, I'm not going to be the reason it doesn't work. She studied him for a long moment, recalculating, the way she'd learned to recalculate everything about this station in the last several days. That's a dangerous thing to tell a superior technician you barely know the reasons for. Maybe Corvath managed something that wasn't quite a smile, tired and a little frightened and entirely sincere. But I've spent 11 months flinching at something I couldn't name. I'd rather know what it is I'm actually flinching at than keep pretending I don't. The Cascade Protocol authorization cleared 2 days later, on the strength of a justification memo Vrail had drafted herself, framing 8 months of dormancy not as an acknowledgement of the protocol's danger, but as a deliberate, patient scientific restraint. A program husbanding its most decisive tool for the moment it would matter most. Riel read the memo once. In the routing queue, she wasn't technically cleared to access but had learned, over 4 years, exactly how to reach anyway, and felt something in her chest go cold and very still, the way it had the day she'd first understood, watching a 19-year-old's file get quietly redirected, exactly how far this station's command structure was willing to go once its own survival was the thing on the table. She spent that night doing something she had never once done in 3 years of secret record-keeping. She went back through the entire spindle, all 1,144 logged sessions, cross-referencing her manual subinterval readings, taken, always, at the 2, 5, and 8-second marks inside every restraint release window, points the automated system's fixed 30-second sampling cadence had never once caught, against the official record Corvath filed for every trial. The pattern she had suspected for 3 years sat there now in front of her, undeniable and exact. Not one formula, in 1,144 attempts, had ever failed to produce a measurable physiological response. Every single one had worked, biologically, exactly as designed. What the machines recorded as 0 was not the absence of an effect. It was the presence of a man spending every ounce of discipline he had, session after session for 4 years, making sure the effect never showed. She sat with that fact for a long time in the small hours of the station's night cycle, the spindle warm against her palm, and understood that she was no longer simply a technician who happened to notice things. She was the only person alive who knew the actual shape of what had been happening in Chamber 9 for 4 years, and in 6 days, in front of a tribunal inspection team and an overseer adjutant with nothing left to lose, that shape was about to collide with a protocol that had already killed one person exactly like him. She did not sleep. She spent the remaining hours before her shift doing something else she had never done before. Drafting, in a private file, a formal statement of everything her spindle contained, structured the way she had watched directorate procedural documents get structured for 4 years, citing the specific clause of the directorate's foundational testing doctrine that she had once memorized as a junior technician and never once expected to need. The unmediated response clause, written into the earliest charter of the directorate's entire pharmacological governance framework 4,000 years ago. The clause that made every pacification compound in 11,000 tribute worlds trustworthy in the first place. No result obtained through active, undisclosed subject countermeasure could be certified as valid directorate data, under any authority, at any tier of command. She did not know yet, closing the file an hour before her shift began, whether she would ever have the nerve to use it. She only knew that she had, for the first time in 4 years, stopped simply watching what happened in Chamber 9 and started preparing to be part of what happened next. She went to him that night anyway, sweep week caution or not, because some calculations stopped being about risk once the number of days left dropped low enough. He was awake when she let herself in, sitting on the edge of the cot with the small window's gray glare behind him, and he read something in her face before she'd said a word. "You've decided something." "I've written something." She didn't sit this time. She stood in the middle of the small cell with her hands folded in front of her, the way she imagined a person stood when they were about to say a thing they'd rehearsed and still weren't sure they had the nerve to finish. A formal statement. Everything the spindle has. If it comes to it, if the tribunal runs the cascade protocol and Vrail gets the result she wants, I'm going to use it. I wanted you to know before it happens, not after, because you should get a vote in a decision that's going to matter more to your life than mine. Dane was quiet for a long moment, and when he answered, it wasn't the answer she'd braced for. What happens to you if you use it and it doesn't work? If Ashendale, or whoever they send, decides an HFY technician with an unauthorized 4-year record is a bigger problem than an overseer adjutant with a failing program? I don't know. I've thought about it every night since I started drafting it, and I still don't know, and I'm doing it anyway. She held his gaze, steady in a way that surprised her, because she had spent most of the last 4 years being the calm one across a restraint bar and had never once had to be calm about her own fate instead of his. I told myself for a long time this was about the doctrine, about accuracy. I still believe that part. But it isn't only that anymore, and I'm done pretending it is. Riel, I need you to do something for me too if it goes the other way. She said it fast before she lost the nerve, because there was a second half to this conversation that mattered more than the first. If it goes wrong, if I don't get the chance to say any of this on the record, or I say it and it isn't enough, I need you to know I found the enclave relay frequencies 8 months ago, buried in a supply manifest I wasn't supposed to have clearance for. I never used them. I never even wrote them down anywhere the spindle could be traced to. But I know them, and if there's ever a day you're free and I'm not, that's a debt I'm calling in now instead of later. Get word to Aldermarsh, if it still stands, that a courier named Halloran kept every coordinate he ever carried, for 4 years, in a room built specifically to take them from him. 9,000 people ought to know that, whatever else happens to either of us. Something moved through his face then that she had never once seen there in 4 years. Not the flat readiness she'd catalogued 100 times, not the careful stillness he wore like armor, but something closer to the boy Wren must have knelt beside once in the ruins of a city neither of them would ever see again, entirely unguarded for the length of a single breath. 4 counts in, he said quietly, and it took her a moment to understand he wasn't talking to himself. 4 counts held, 6 counts out. Control your face, control your breath, and you can walk through things that should put you on the ground. My sister taught me that for 1 wound at a time. She never once mentioned what to do about a room. You built the rest of it yourself. I had 4 years and nothing else to spend them on. He stood slowly, the way he always gave his body time to arrange itself, and for a moment they were simply facing each other in a cell too small for either of them to pretend the moment was smaller than it was. If it goes the way you're afraid it will, I'll get word to Aldermarsh myself, somehow, someday, if it takes the rest of whatever life the directorate leaves me. But it isn't going to go that way, Riel. Not because I have some new confidence I didn't have yesterday. Because you walked in here tonight already having decided to spend yourself on this, the same way I decided 4 years ago, and I've never once seen you decide something and then fail to see it through. That's a lot of faith to put in a technician with a date a spindle, and no rank worth mentioning. It's exactly the amount of faith you've earned. He almost smiled, thin and real, and she let herself hold on to it a moment longer than protocol would have allowed, because in 6 hours the corridor logs would matter again, and tonight, for 11 more minutes, they didn't. The Tribunal's shuttle docked at Kestrel Anchor at the start of first shift on the 6th day, 4 hours ahead of even the revised schedule, and Riel learned about it the way she learned most things that mattered on this station now, second-hand, through a routing alert that reached her console 11 minutes after the fact. by which point Vrail had already redirected the entire morning's operations around the change. The observation gallery above Chamber 9, a narrow reinforced glass mezzanine that had sat unused for most of the wing's 4-year history, was fully staffed by the time Riel reached her station. 3 tribunal auditors in the gray travel dress of the Directorate Council's Inspection Corps, and at their center, a tall, silver-eyed official whose insignia marked him as prefect rank, a title Riel had only ever seen referenced in station-wide bulletins and never once in the same room as her own work. Torv Ashendale. She had never heard the name before that morning. She would not forget it after. Vrail stood at the gallery's edge, addressing the prefect directly in the clipped, confident cadence of someone who had rehearsed this exact conversation in front of a mirror more than once. 4 years of incremental calibration have brought us to the threshold of a definitive finding, prefect. Today's trial represents the culmination of that work under full combined agent protocol, conducted, as I trust the record will show, with appropriate caution and under direct executive supervision throughout. Your record shows 1,144 prior trials with 0 certified positive results, Overseer Adjutant, Ashendale said, his tone giving away nothing at all. I am here to determine whether that record reflects 4 years of rigorous science or 4 years of an unproductive program being kept alive by its own sunk cost. I would encourage you not to mistake my presence in this gallery for an endorsement of either conclusion. Then let the trial speak for itself, Vrail said, and turned toward the chamber below, where Korvath and a second technician were already securing Dane into the restraint frame, the drip lines for Formula 1146, the Cascade Protocol's full combined agent designation, already primed and waiting. Riel took her station at the primary console, the spindle a small hard weight against her collarbone, and watched Dane's eyes find hers across the chamber for exactly 1 second before Korvath's hands blocked the line of sight, securing the final restraint strap. In that 1 second, she saw something she had never once seen from him in 4 years of shared shifts and 1,144 sessions. Not fear, not quite, but a kind of resigned, clear-eyed readiness, the look of a man who had done the arithmetic on this particular morning 100 times already and arrived, every time, at the same number. Administering, Korvath said, and the drip began. The first 90 seconds ran the way every session had run for 4 years, Dane's pulse settling into its familiar counted rhythm, his face arranging itself into the same still, unremarkable calm Riel had watched him build, session after session, out of nothing but discipline and 4 counts in, 4 counts held, 6 counts out. The gallery watched a bank of readouts stay level. Ashendale said nothing. Vrail's shoulders, Riel noted without looking directly at her, had begun to relax by the second minute, the posture of a woman starting to believe her own justification memo. At the 2-minute 40-second mark, Formula 1146's third agent entered his bloodstream, a compound the Cascade Protocol's own restricted file described as capable of overwhelming, in a subject without extraordinary neurological resistance, every voluntary suppression mechanism the human nervous system possessed. Riel watched the monitors the way she had watched them 1,144 times before, and for the first time in 4 years, at the 2-minute 51-second mark, she watched a number move. Pulse 74, then 81. On the primary chamber display, visible to every auditor in the gallery, a tremor sensor that had read negative for 1,144 consecutive trials flickered, for 0.6 of a second, into positive. There, Vrail said, and the word came out of her with a raw, unguarded satisfaction that told Riel more about 4 years of desperation than any report ever had. Prefect Ashendale there. Confirmed physiological response, first in directorate testing history, 4 years of methodical. Overseer Adjutant. Riel's own voice surprised her, cutting across the gallery's rising murmur with a steadiness she had not planned and did not fully recognize as her own. Before this trial is certified, I request the record reflect prior documented evidence relevant to its interpretation. Every head in the observation gallery turned toward her console. Vrail's expression shifted from triumph to something colder in the span of a single breath. Technician Sonar, this is not the moment. With respect, Overseer Adjutant, it is precisely the moment, Riel said, and drew the spindle from beneath her collar, her hand steadier than she had any right to expect it to be. Prefect Ashendale, I am the primary calibration technician assigned to this program for the entirety of its 4-year duration. I have personally recorded, in a private log maintained in parallel with the official station record, physiological data from every one of the 1,144 trials preceding this one. Data captured at sampling intervals the station's automated systems do not use, and were, I believe, never intended to catch. This is an unauthorized record, Vrail said, sharp now, the color gone from her voice entirely. Prefect, Technician Sonar has no standing to introduce. Directorate Testing Standards Code, Article 1, the Unmediated Response Clause, Ashendale said, and his silver eyes had not moved from Riel since she'd spoken, grants any credentialed observer standing to introduce evidence bearing on data integrity, Overseer Adjutant, regardless of its origin, provided it was gathered by a party with direct access to the trial in question. I suggest you sit down. He turned back to Riel. Continue, Technician. Riel's hands did not shake as she keyed the spindle's contents into the gallery's shared display. My data shows that Subject Halloran has produced a measurable, consistent physiological response to every compound tested against him across 4 years and 1,144 trials, without exception. What the automated record shows as 0 is not the absence of an effect. It is the presence of a subject actively, deliberately suppressing every externally detectable marker of that effect through a trained physiological discipline, session after session, for 4 years. She let the numbers sit on the display for a moment before she said the rest of it, because Ashendale and every officer in that gallery needed to see the pattern before they heard the conclusion. By the Directorate's own foundational testing doctrine, a result achieved under undisclosed active subject countermeasure cannot be certified as valid data at any tier of command. Not this trial, not the 1,144 before it. The entire program's record, Prefect, has been contaminated from its very first session. Vrail moved before anyone in the gallery had finished processing the sentence, 3 fast steps toward the gallery's own secondary console, the one that mirrored, for observation purposes, every display in the chamber below, including, Riel understood with a cold lurch, the shared feed Riel had just keyed the spindle's contents into. Her hand was already reaching for the console's emergency data integrity override, a purge function built for exactly one purpose, wiping a corrupted feed before it could propagate to permanent record, when one of Ashendale's own auditors stepped into her path with the flat, practiced economy of someone who had clearly done this before, in some other gallery, for some other overseer who had run out of better options. Overseer Adjutant Vrail. The auditor didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Interference with an active tribunal record is a separate offense from the one currently under review. I would advise you to consider very carefully whether you want to add it to your file in front of a prefect. Vrail's hand stopped a few centimeters from the console, hovering there for a long, suspended second while every calculation she had left visibly ran out at once, and then dropped to her side. This is a fabrication, she said instead, turning back toward Ashendale, her voice climbing towards something that was no longer entirely controlled. Prefect, an HFY technician with 4 years of unsupervised access to this program's raw data, has motive to falsify a record that discredits her own superior. I would ask the tribunal to consider the source before it considers the content. I have considered the source, Overseer Adjutant, Ashendale said, and something in his tone had gone flatter, harder, the patient precision of a man whose patience had just run out in full view of 11 witnesses. The source is a technician who has spent 4 years risking her own tribute, standing to maintain a record more accurate than the one you submitted under your own authority this morning. I find that source considerably more credible than the overseer adjutant currently reaching for a purge switch in front of me. Sit down, or I will have you removed from this gallery entirely, and the record will show why. The gallery went quiet in a way that had nothing performed about it. Not the stock, hollow silence of a stunned crowd, but the specific, working silence of trained officials doing rapid arithmetic on the size of a problem they had just been handed. That is a serious allegation to level against 4 years of your own recorded work, technician, Ashendale said, and his tone was not unkind, only precise. You understand what you are telling this tribunal, not that the program has produced a positive result, that it has produced no valid result at all, and that its overseer adjutant has known, or should have known, that the safety and distress markers of her subject were being systematically misrepresented, including, I note, in the final escalation authorized this morning. I understand exactly what I'm telling you, Prefect, Riel said. I have one more piece of evidence I am required, under the same doctrine, to enter into the record. 8 months ago, an unsanctioned trial of this same combined agent protocol was run against a prior subject, designated Petrosian. Why, without the safety review this doctrine requires for escalation beyond baseline. That subject died within 4 minutes. The protocol was locked pending tribunal review. It was unlocked this week by executive order of Overseer Adjutant Vrail, without new safety data, under conditions that, by my own documented record, filed continuously across every prior session, she had every reason to know involved a subject already showing consistent, if concealed, signs of cumulative physiological cost. Below the gallery, in the chamber itself, Dane's pulse had climbed to 91 and was still rising, the tremor sensor's flicker steadying into something more constant. The discipline that had held for 4 years finally, visibly, beginning to give way under a dose engineered specifically to overwhelm it. Corvath, watching his own readouts with the particular horror of a man realizing exactly how much worse this could get in the next 30 seconds, looked up toward the gallery without waiting for authorization. Prefect, the subject's cardiac markers are outside safe parameters. I need authorization to stop the trial, Ashendale said, before Corvath had finished the sentence, in the flat, immediate tone of a man who had already made the only decision available to him. Full withdrawal, medical team to Chamber 9, now. Overseer Adjutant Vrail, you are relieved of executive authority over this program effective immediately, pending formal inquiry into data falsification and unsanctioned protocol authorization. Escort her to holding. Vrail did not move for a long moment, her face doing something complicated and unguarded that Riel had never once seen it do in 4 years. Not fury, not quite, but the specific collapse of a person watching every calculation she had built her life on turn out, all at once, to have been wrong. Then 2 of the auditors were beside her, and she was moving, not resisting, the way people moved when the machinery of their own institution finally closed around them instead of shielding them. And she did not look back at the gallery, or at the chamber below, or at Riel, before the door sealed behind her. Below, the drip lines were already withdrawn, the restraints already loosening, a medical team already moving through the chamber door with the brisk efficiency of people trained for exactly this contingency and grateful, for once, to be allowed to use it in time. Riel watched Dane's pulse crest at 98 and begin slowly to fall, watched his chest rise and fall in the ragged, uncounted rhythm of a body finally, after 4 years, being permitted to simply feel what it felt without paying for the privilege of hiding it, and felt something in her own chest come loose that she had been holding, she realized only now, for a very long time. Prefect Ashendale remained in the gallery for a long moment after the chamber below had stabilized, studying the readouts, the emptied restraint frame, the technician standing at her console with a data spindle still glowing faintly in her hand. When he finally spoke, it was to Riel alone, the rest of the gallery already filing out behind him. You understand what you have done to this program, Technician Sonar. 1,144 trials, 4 years, an entire line of pharmacological inquiry the Directorate Council has watched with considerable interest, and by your own testimony, all of it is now void, inadmissible. This station's contribution to Directorate doctrine on the subject of human physiological response is, as of this morning, exactly what it was on the day this program began. Nothing. Yes, Prefect. You could have said nothing. Let the trial certify. Let the record stand as Vrail wanted it to stand. Ashendale's silver eyes studied her with an attention that felt, for the first time since he'd arrived, less like an audit and more like an actual question. The Directorate Council has waited 4,000 years for a species this program's premise might have finally cracked. You have just told me, on the morning it looked closest to succeeding, that the attempt was never valid in the first place, and that the man in that chamber has spent 4 years making sure it never would be. Yes, Prefect, Riel said again, and found to her own mild surprise that she had nothing else prepared to add to it, no justification, no appeal to mercy, only the plain fact of what she had done and why. The record has to be accurate, or it isn't Directorate doctrine at all. It's just whatever gets a failing overseer adjutant through her next review. I've spent 4 years watching what this program actually costs. I wasn't willing to spend a 5th one lying about it so it could cost more. Ashendale held her gaze for a long moment, long enough that Riel understood he was doing arithmetic of his own, weighing something that had nothing to do with data integrity clauses. There will be a formal review of your own conduct as well, Technician. Unauthorized parallel record-keeping is, technically, a violation in its own right, whatever its outcome served today. He paused at the gallery door. I would not expect it to go badly for you, but I would not expect it to go unnoticed either. 4,000 years of doctrine does not survive by pretending its keepers never bend it. It survives by making sure someone, eventually, tells the truth about when they did. He left without waiting for a reply, and Riel stood alone in the emptying gallery for a moment before she made herself move, down through the narrow access corridor to the chamber below, where the medical team was finishing its work, and Dane sat on the edge of the recovery cot, still breathing hard, a blanket someone had draped over his shoulders that he had not yet had the strength to shrug off. He looked up when she came in, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. 4 years of careful professional distance, and 1,144 sessions of watching each other survive the same room compressed, in that silence, into something too large for either of them to open with a word. You told them, he said finally, his voice hoarse. I told them the truth. That's the same thing as handing them a result, Riel. That's 4 years of me trying to make sure they never got one. There was no accusation in it, only a raw, exhausted uncertainty, the look of a man doing the same arithmetic Ashendale had done and arriving at a very different question. What happens to the enclaves if word of this gets out? If someone up the chain decides the interesting part isn't that the trial's invalid, it's that a compound worked, once on paper, no matter what happened after. Nothing worked, Dane. Riel crossed the chamber and sat beside him on the cot's edge, close enough that the blanket's edge brushed her arm, closer than 4 years of careful distance had ever quite allowed. That's the whole point of the clause. Not the compound almost worked and we'll fix the loophole next time. Inadmissible means it never happened, as far as Directorate doctrine is concerned. 1,145 formulas, and the record, the real record, the one that goes into every future council report on human physiological resistance, still reads 0. Nothing has ever measurably affected a human being under Directorate testing protocol. That's what 4,000 years of their own doctrine forces them to write down, because I made sure the only alternative was admitting they'd have to burn their entire pharmacological rulebook to say otherwise, and they are never, ever going to do that. She looked at him, at the exhaustion and the disbelief both still sitting plainly on a face that had spent 4 years learning to show nothing at all, and something in her chest ached with a feeling she no longer had any interest in pretending was only professional concern. The secret's still safe. It's just not a secret from me anymore. That's the only thing that's changed. He was quiet for a long moment, processing that, the blanket finally slipping from one shoulder as he let his guard down in a way Riel had never once seen him do inside these walls. 4 years, he said at last, and you never told anyone. 4 years, and I never had a reason good enough to risk you for it. Today I did. She managed something that was almost a smile, thin and worn but real, the mirror of the one he'd given her in his cell 6 days ago. Turns out watching a friend nearly die in front of a tribunal is exactly that kind of reason. The words sat between them for a moment, plain and unremarkable and enormous all at once, 4 years overdue and finally spoken aloud in a room built to measure everything, except the one thing that had actually kept him alive in it. The formal inquiry into Kessa Vrail's conduct concluded 9 days later, conducted with the unhurried, exhaustive thoroughness the Directorate Council applied to any matter touching the integrity of its foundational doctrine. She was stripped of her overseer adjutant rank, reassigned to a records archival post on a tribute world 11 jumps from Kestrel Anchor, a demotion the Council's own summary described, without evident irony, as reflecting her demonstrated priorities. The calibration wing itself was placed under provisional closure, pending a full doctrinal review, not of whether humans might someday be found vulnerable to some undiscovered compound, but of whether any future testing program touching a live subject would ever again be permitted to operate without an independent observer holding standing equal to the overseer running it. Prefect Ashendale's closing report, 3 lines of which Riel would later commit to memory without ever quite deciding to, noted that the doctrine had, in this instance, worked exactly as designed. Slowly, imperfectly, 4 years too late for the woman named Petrosian, but in time for the man it had almost cost a fifth. Korvath's own review took less time than either of theirs and produced, in the end, the strangest outcome of the 3. He had flagged the cardiac markers without waiting for authorization in the trial's final seconds, a technical breach of protocol, since only the prefect held standing to halt an active session, but one the inquiry panel noted, in language dry enough that Riel suspected someone on the panel had enjoyed writing it, as the correct instinct exercised a half-second before the correct authority caught up to it. He kept his post. He was, if anything, harder to rattle afterward than he had been in 11 months of flinching at every drip. Riel noticed it the first time she passed him in a corridor after the inquiry closed, a young officer who had spent most of a year assuming the discomfort he felt in Chamber 9 was simply squeamishness he needed to grow out of, and who had learned in the space of one morning that it had been the correct response all along. Petrick's file took longer to surface than either of theirs, buried as it was in the much larger tide of tribute processing paperwork the Directorate generated across 11,000 worlds every single day. But it surfaced eventually, forwarded to Riel's new observer credentials 3 weeks into her first posting, as a matter the Council's doctrinal review had specifically flagged for retroactive correction. The same clause that had reclassified Dane as a contaminated evidentiary asset applied, the review found, to any subject whose file bore even a provisional connection to the calibration wing's now voided testing record, and Petrick's transfer manifest, however briefly it had touched the wing before Vrail rerouted him, counted. He was pulled from standard tribute processing on a technicality neither he nor anyone processing him had ever been meant to notice, and reassigned, under the same new protections that now shadowed Dane's own file, to a holding designation that closed the door on ever being routed back through a room like Chamber 9 again. Riel read the correction order twice, alone in her new quarters, and felt something in her settle that she hadn't fully realized she'd been carrying since the morning she'd watched a 19-year-old's transfer manifest cross her console. Riel's own review, conducted in a single afternoon by a panel, with considerably less patience for procedural nuance than Ashendale had shown, resulted in a formal reprimand for unauthorized parallel record-keeping and a reassignment, not to a records archival post on a distant tribute world, but, at Ashendale's own quiet recommendation, to the newly mandated independent observer roster the Council's doctrinal review had just created. A role that did not yet exist anywhere else in the Directorate, and that put her, for the first time in 4 years, on the same side of the observation glass as the prefect who had once told her that doctrine survived by someone, eventually, telling the truth. Dane's disposition took longer to settle. 3 weeks of transfer orders drafted, revised, and quietly buried by a council bureaucracy, still working out exactly what to do with a test subject whose entire testing history had just been ruled, in its own official language, to have never happened. He was reclassified in the end, under an obscure clause of Directorate holding law that Riel had never heard of before Ashendale cited it in the closing paperwork. Contaminated evidentiary asset, non-testable, transfer pending disposition review, a designation that afforded him, for the first time in 1,501 days, protection under a Directorate statute rather than mere administrative convenience. No further testing, no further Chamber 9. A holding status the Council's own doctrine now forbade anyone from quietly escalating past, because the doctrine that had just cost Kessa Vrail her career existed, above everything else, to make sure no one ever again mistook a suppressed result for a safe one. He was not free. Riel understood that plainly, standing with him in the transfer bay on the morning his shuttle was finally scheduled, watching a Directorate escort team run through the same procedural checklist that had processed 1,000 prisoners before him and would process 1,000 more after. Freedom was not a thing this system had any mechanism left inside it to grant, not to a relay line courier with 6 years of hidden coordinates still living somewhere behind his eyes. Not this year, maybe not for a long time yet. But he would go to a holding facility that had never heard of Formula 1146, under a designation that made him, on paper, more trouble to touch than he was worth. And he would go there with his own body finally his own again. No longer a battlefield he had to win, alone, twice a day, for 4 years running. "I heard about Petrick," he said, before the escort team called the transfer window, his voice pitched low enough that it wouldn't carry past the two of them. "The correction order. You told me once there was nothing either of us could do about that particular fact. Turns out you found something anyway." "I didn't find it. Ashendale's doctrinal review did. I just made sure the review had a reason to look at his file at all." Riel considered the strange, roundabout shape of it, a boy she'd glimpsed once through a corridor viewport, saved in the end by a clause neither of them would ever know existed unless someone eventually told him. "He'll never know your name" was the reason his transfer manifest got pulled first. Doesn't seem right, somehow, that he won't. "He doesn't need to know my name. He needs to still be alive in 4 years, the way I am." Dane looked at her, something steady and unhurried in it, the look of a man who had made his peace with being owed nothing by the people he'd spent himself protecting. That was always the only part of the math that mattered, Riel, not the credit. Just the number of people still standing at the end of it. Riel didn't have an answer for that one ready-made, and found, for once, that she didn't need one. That standing there in the transfer bay with 6 days and 4 years both finally behind them, some things were better left simply agreed with in silence. The escort team called the 2-minute warning, and Dane glanced toward the sound before his attention came back to her. "You'll be on the observer roster," he said, as the escort team finished its final check. That mean you'll end up wherever they send me? It means I'll ask, Riel said. It's not a promise. The council doesn't promise anything to anyone below prefect rank. No, but you kept a secret for 4 years without ever once being asked to. I'm starting to think you don't actually need a promise to show up. He held her gaze for a long moment, the same look she'd seen in that 1 second across Chamber 9, 6 days and a lifetime ago, not fear now, and not the flat readiness of a man doing arithmetic on his own survival, but something plainer and harder to name, the specific, quiet gratitude of a person who had spent 4 years learning to trust exactly no one and had, somewhere in the middle of it, without either of them quite choosing the moment, made an exception. The escort called the transfer window. He went, walking under his own power, unrestrained, out of a station that had spent 4 years and 1,145 formulas trying to find one substance in the galaxy that could break him, and had instead only ever found the one thing that already had every reason to. A friend, patient enough to notice what 4 years of instruments never could, and brave enough, in the one moment it mattered most, to say so. Somewhere in the Directorate Council's sealed archive, filed under a doctrinal review that would shape testing protocol across 11,000 tribute worlds for a generation, the calibration wing's final report closed with the same bloodless certainty it had opened with 4 years and 1,145 formulas earlier. No substance, yet catalogued by Directorate Science, had ever produced a certified physiological effect on a human subject. The record, read by any auditor who ever pulled it, would say exactly what it had always said. It would never say what the number had actually cost to stay true, or who had spent 4 years making sure it did, or that the real discovery of the calibration wing's entire existence had nothing to do with chemistry at all, that somewhere behind every one of those 1,145 zeros was a man who had simply decided once, a very long time ago, that some things were worth enduring in silence, and a friend who had decided, when it finally mattered, that some silences were worth breaking. Riel kept the spindle. She never filed it, never surrendered it to any archive, official or otherwise. On the long transit to her first posting under the new observer roster, she added one final entry to a record that officially did not exist, in a hand no scanner would ever be built to read for meaning. Not a number, not a formula, not a data point at all. 4 words and beneath them the date. He was never broken. He only ever chose to be still.